Hi, my name is Sue Johnson, and I started working in various aspects of the industry in 2002. I did an MFA at Ryerson University in documentary media, and I remember there was this day where I was working on a documentary that I was directing, and I was working with a camera person. Typically before that, I was directing and DOPing anything that I was doing and doing that combined role. And it was the first day that I was really not shooting, not behind the camera. And I remember feeling both, really intrigued by this, but also feeling kind of left out in a way and realizing that I felt like my role was always going to be on the camera regardless. I started making my own films and then decided that I was interested in making documentaries. And so I came to Toronto and went to Ryerson University. And from there, after doing that, I decided to go into the camera trainee program through IATSE 667 because I was really interested in learning more about how, basically being in the camera department worked on all kinds of productions, on fiction productions, on narrative productions, TV, all that sort of stuff. So I went through the trainee program and then camera assisted for about 5 years afterwards. And simultaneously, I was also shooting. I think the sensibilities that I bring to the table are really informed by photography. So I bring a strong sense of composition to the table. I'm also really interested in palette and art direction as well. And so, I love lighting. Absolutely, that's often one of the first things I look at in terms of when I'm in a space. But I find that one of the big things that I bring is definitely that looking at the whole space and what way should we be shooting in terms of what can we move into this space to make it look a certain way as well. And and I always love working with color. I think I'm a really good listener. I think I'm an excellent collaborator. I feel very much a part of the productions that I'm on and like I have a voice in them. But I think that also speaks to the relationships that I have with the directors that I work with. So when I work on a project, I tend to, the director and I tend to have a pretty solid relationship. And I'll work with directors again and again. And so we get to a point where it's really nice in terms of, okay, this is overall what I need. I trust you to go and shoot it. And so that's a great place to be, but I think that also speaks to being able to be trusted. On set, I see my role as that of a collaborator, as that of someone that is able to translate direction into very specific visuals. Also, in a certain sense, can take a variety of ideas and then say, okay, what about this order of shooting them? What about, I guess in a sense, I also see myself as somewhat of a gateway too. Because often on documentary shoots, there is no AD saying, we've got this much time and we can do this. And hopefully you've had some conversations before, but not always, right? And so I think it's also, about setting expectations for everyone and making sure that everyone feels good about what they're getting, but also that there's enough time so that everyone feels good about what has been gotten. I think that probably my biggest struggle, is going really fast. A lot of the day, I feel like, weighs on the cinematographer in terms of what you have time to get. And so I feel it's really important to be incredibly efficient about how you're thinking through things in terms of especially prep to make sure that you're maximizing the opportunities for the day. Right? And so, just making sure, just doing things like prepping everything, making sure that you've had conversations with the director ahead of time so that you arrive on set fully prepared and can just make the day as easy as possible. I love working with older cinematographers or anyone who's been directing for a little while or anything like that, because also too, there's that, it's kind of that decision gets made and it's effortless, but that a lot of thought has gone into it. And that's something that I really aspire to, is just being able to say that and know it, and then everything else kind of falls into place. I think that I didn't know it was an option for a long time. I think that lack of role models is key too. it's funny because it's subtle and it's something that you're not even always aware of. At least I wasn't aware of it, especially when I was young. But afterwards, yeah, I think that having access to even just seeing women being cinematographers is huge as well. But it's hard to have opportunities to assist in documentary. So I went into fiction to assist because I couldn't find any other opportunities. I felt like that was a really good way to learn and just get exposure. But I think in terms of what I do now, I in some ways wish that someone had told me to just shoot and no one told me to assist necessarily before. And I still think that that was actually a really fantastic experience that not a lot of people do anymore, you know? And I gained a lot from it, but there's part of me that also feels, you know, like a more direct path in some ways would have just been to shoot and only do that and work on that skill set. I think the character traits that make me a good cinematographer are that I'm creative, but I'm also very open to listening to other people's ideas. And in general, I try and combine ideas to make things work. I'm also very diplomatic. I also try as much as possible to never say no. I try and find a solution to the situation, and yeah. But at the same time, again, there's always, you know, there are situations, of course, where you have to put your foot down, but in hopefully a polite, collaborative way. I remember taking a CSC lighting workshop, and it was the second lighting workshop that I'd taken, and it was taken a little later in my career after I'd been shooting and considering myself a cinematographer more like for 4 or 5 years. And I remember taking that workshop and feeling so great about it because I had realized that I had a system that worked very well for the kind of work that I was doing, and that, you know, I just felt like I had guiding principles. And I just remember after doing my setup feeling great about, I was like, I know how to do this. I really know how to do this, you know? And that was kind of my aha moment. But it's funny because it was in relation to, it wasn't like anyone else didn't know what they were doing, but it was just that moment of confidence where I felt really like I could really go out onto any documentary set and feel like I was doing the best job possible for the director in that moment and feeling really good about my lighting specifically. In terms of the things that I'm most proud of at this point, I worked on a documentary about the residential school system with Al Jazeera International, and that was a real highlight. That was fantastic to work with a crew from Beirut who came over, and you know, we were largely working on Six Nations at the Mohawk Institute. I'd never been on a shoot like that where we had worked with, you know, a community that had been so traumatized and so victimized. And the candid nature with which the interviewees were able to speak to us about their histories, I found incredibly meaningful. And so that was a really interesting doc in terms of the production of it, I found. You know, Al Jazeera has a very specific way that they cut and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of the production, it was kind of like we were set free. I was really surprised. It was the first time that I had really worked for a news organization. And it was almost like a POV doc in a way as well. So I saw them give their director a lot of freedom, you know, to do whatever, right? Which also translated to what I was allowed to do. So it was a really lovely setup in terms of the kind of shots that we could do. And yeah, as said, the subject matter was very dark, but at the same time, it was, you know, I think very powerful and revealing. I just finished my first feature film, which feels really great as well. And that is a documentary that was largely shot outside of San Francisco, and it's about, it's called Better Living Through Chemistry, and it is about the couple that among other things, has made 200 different psychedelics, revived MDMA, and started the therapeutic model for using psychedelics. So it's a fantastic documentary that's going to be coming out this year, and that I would say is, my first feature and definitely a career highlight too. I think that a big thing, and I'm going to speak mostly to documentary here, is that, it feels like, you're relied upon to do almost everything, whereas I think that assisting was much more of a thing in documentary. You'd often have someone out with you, which isn't something that I see happening as much anymore. So I think that there is, and I'm not sure if that's because when we had film cameras, you really, really needed someone, you had to have someone to help you with loading, among other things, so there was something about the medium that dictated that you would kind of have more people assisting you. But I think that the role of the cinematographer, in some ways in documentary has gotten a lot more sophisticated. And I think that what I like about working in documentary now is that you are fully, encouraged to borrow conventions from fiction, that, you're not always just, okay, you've got a half an hour to light. You know what I mean? You can actually build in time to light and to make things look, like a palette that might actually resemble something from a fiction film. Every interview has to, work with the themes that are across the whole film. How do we do that? How do we make this interview fit into this? Well, we need to think about this location. We need to think about what kind of, are we going to high key, low key light it? All those sorts of questions that, I feel like are much more the domain in some ways of fiction, and that have now been opened up by documentary. I worked on fiction sets for a period of time, about 7 years or so, and I think the biggest change that I would like to see in the industry is less working hours, specifically in scripted. I think that it is unhealthy to be working 15 to 18 hours a day, which was my experience of camera assisting in the industry. And especially if you're back-to-backing on shows. I think that that's, again, a lot of people, it's interesting when that gets brought up on set. A lot of people's argument is, if I'm going to be here for 12, I'd rather be here for 16, and get the overtime. That's, again, that's not my opinion. I think that having working hours, I think between 10 and 12 hours would be reasonable. And this is also, too, I think why, documentary has always been my passion in terms of the actual content. But I think, too, typically documentary shoots run usually somewhere, I find, more between 8 to 12 hours. Some days you're doing like a 14, but it's kind of like that's a really big day. You get ample warning. That's not necessarily your everyday experience. So I think the working hours would be a big thing that I would say for scripted. Yeah, I think making them a little more reasonable. The types of projects that I'd like to tackle still in my career are long form docs, and I would like to also tackle social issues. I do enjoy biopics as well. I just finished up doing additional photography and BCam op on a documentary about Margaret Atwood, which was a really fascinating experience in terms of just hearing, everything behind her career and, things that I just had no idea about regarding why this image shows up here, what's the background to that. So but I would say long form doc, but I'm also really excited. I worked in scripted as an assistant, and I've done a few narrative projects in terms of DOPing, and I'm definitely interested in doing shorts as well. I mean, I would love to do a feature. I'm feeling right now like I'm more concentrated in documentary and very happy to keep in that world, but there's also part of me, I loved those setups. And I love the ability in scripted to really have so many resources and to build a universe, right? And so I find that really exciting. So a project where you get to really build a universe from the ground up. I would love to work with Kirsten Johnson, absolutely, who is an American cinematographer, and recently did a documentary called Camera Person, which is a compendium of a whole bunch of projects that she's shot, and it's a selection of, basically stuff that didn't make it into the cut, right? But it's this, there's no narration, it's just all imagery tied together, and it's beautiful. If I could work with any director, I would actually love to work with Bruce LaBruce, who is an experimental Canadian director who, works in all kinds of different formats. But yeah, I find Bruce LaBruce's work really fun and interesting as well. And I think in terms of, Canadian directors, I love Bruce. When you asked the question earlier about, what qualities make you a good cinematographer, make you a good collaborator, what, personality traits and all that sort of stuff. It was funny, I went back to it and I was like, I left out creativity. Just going back to that for a moment, I think that one of the big things I bring too is, the eye and the, being able to look at any situation, hopefully come up with some creative solutions to it, whether it be a problem that we're having or whether it be just the look of the film or video that we're doing. I think the job of a director is, there's so much pressure and it's hard to always, it's hard to always see everything, right? And same with being a cinematographer. And so I really love that relationship between a director and cinematographer, because ideally you're bringing all you've got to the table, but also if someone's not seeing something, you kind of nudge each other in a direction. The collaboration with the director ideally is like 1 + 1 = 3. In 2010, I went into the industry proper, unionized industry, and as a camera trainee. And at that point, at the intro seminar, I remember there's a woman assistant who is giving the intro seminar, and she said, just heads up for all you ladies in the audience, there is a glass ceiling, and the glass ceiling is currently at first AC for all of you. And I was shocked that she said that to a group of 30 incoming trainees, and I was like, okay. But she was absolutely right. It was absolutely true. Literally, when I started in terms of DPs, the only DPs that I knew of that were showing up on the production report, Kim Durko would show up on the production report, and I'm talking 667 stuff here. Maya Bankovic a few years later, but it was pretty grim in terms of the amount of shows and who was getting to DP them. And so, and then I would see a lot of, there's, at that point too, IATSE was really trying to up the numbers of female assistants. And so it was parity in terms of the incoming classes. And the biggest change that I've seen is within that 10-year window, it actually seems to be working. We're not at parity, but I feel like there's been a huge change. And I think it's been really positive. And I think that there is a lot more awareness around this. Specifically, I would say in the last 4 years, that it's kind of like, okay, so why aren't our fantastic assistants upgrading to camera ops? Why is this not happening? Why aren't they stepping out and jumping to DPs even? And so women are starting to do that more now, which I think is wonderful. But it seemed like at that period when I entered into it, it was still in that, it was just before that kind of shift happened. And it really felt like it was still the glass ceiling and everyone was just kind of like not talking about it. So I think that that's been a really big change that I'm seeing, is that women are actually, yeah, I am going to operate, and I'm going to get on shows. And that's happening. The numbers, again, it's still like, whatever it is, it's probably like 3% to, but I'm still really inspired every time I see a female DP or camera op on the production report. I think it's fantastic.